Just tell me when we should start, Sonia. Okay, let us begin. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. Normally in Washington, we don't have many events that focus on Laos, but indeed a lot is going on in that small country. And today, we're very pleased to have the Asia Foundation's country representative, Todd Wassel, speak about development and challenges and opportunities in that country. Todd has been the country representative in Vientiane since 2019. Prior to that, he served as country representative in Timor-Leste. He is someone with a lot of development experience. He has worked in conflict areas such as Kosovo. He's also worked in Sri Lanka. He has extensive experience working with both local and international NGOs in conflict and post-conflict countries, and helping governments develop inclusive decision-making structures for good public policy. His introduction to Asia came from working as an English teacher in Japan for 5 years, and he speaks fluent Japanese. Todd is going to speak for approximately 15 minutes, and then we will open up for questions and comments. If you could kindly put your questions and identify yourself in the Q&A box, and then I will moderate that right after Todd finishes speaking. So thank you all very much for coming, and Todd, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and I say here because I actually am physically in Washington, D.C. at the moment, although you might not ever know it with these virtual presentations these days. But it's a pleasure to be back, and I've been enjoying catching up with a lot of Lao experts and people interested in Lao over the past week. And what I think I'd like to do here with this presentation and the webinar, as John said, is to maybe just give a view of what does Lao look like 2 years into the pandemic, halfway through 2022. And you know, we've been closed. We've just welcomed our first visitors just a few weeks ago. I think Lao officially opened up, and so Lao is normally a place that not a lot of news escapes from, for want of all sorts of other geopolitical things going on in the world. And at the same time, it's an incredibly fascinating, beautiful, rich place that is really working hard to move into the middle income status. At first, I thought it was going to be able to achieve those goals in 2020. Now, as we look out at its trajectory, we're thinking it's more of a 5-year time horizon, and now we're looking at 2024 to 2025. And just about a year ago, the Lao government went through its 5-year planning process, which is called the National Socioeconomic Development Plan, looking at how it would then achieve this middle income status and graduate from least developed country status. And so the big question for us at the moment, for those of us working in Lao, following Laos, is how much has the COVID situation derailed those plans? What are the big challenges that Laos is facing that are unique to COVID and unique to the current global fiscal crisis? And then what are the main kind of structural issues that are continuing to be issues that need to be reformed and looked at to help Laos move up its status? So maybe we'll just start with, I'll talk for just about 10 or 15 minutes, as John said, I intend to cover a pretty broad area of an overview of Laos, maybe throw in a few very specific cases of where I think it's meeting its current challenges and where we have some opportunities as the world opens up. But then I'd really enjoy having a rich discussion after that, going into any type of topics that might be covered in this area. And there's a lot of details that could get into, but just wouldn't be available in a regular 10-minute, 15-minute presentation. So COVID situation. Laos weathered COVID extremely well. Central planning that then put out support to rural health clinics and the distribution of vaccinations went extremely well. Laos shut down its country for just about 2 years. It was almost impossible to come in or go out. And I'd say the first year of the pandemic, we had almost no cases. At first it was unbelievable, but once you look back at the data, it was confirmed. I mean, maybe we had 50 or 60 cases. It was really in 2021 that we started to see an uptick as the Delta variant came across the border. And you'll see in this graph that I have in front of at the bottom that first wave, or that first spike, at least as far as Laos goes, was the Delta. And then we see a really sharp spike that was Omicron. All of that has subsided, I think, in the past few months. And compared to just 4 or 5 months ago, where you knew people that were still catching it, now it seems that the testing regime has reduced quite a bit. That now the official stats are, I think I saw there was 1 case yesterday. So I think what we've moved into is this kind of endemic phase, similar to what Thailand is talking about. The government has opened up the borders. There's no longer a necessity to quarantine. You do need to be vaccinated, or else you do have to quarantine. But with vaccination, you don't have to quarantine. And other than that, you can just apply for a regular tourism visa. And we'll see that tourism visa, or the ability to visit, is really key or central to helping Laos turn the corner around this. But even at the height of COVID, we had maybe, this is from WHO records, maybe 210,000 positive cases, and a really low death count of 756 deaths. So Laos has been largely spared from the health crisis of this, and it's doing pretty well on its vaccinations. We're sitting right kind of in the middle of that 69% for 2 doses. And I don't think we'll be able to get up to that 80% goal that the government set until we're really able to vaccinate kids under the age of 12. And there's some complications about COVAX, what it's authorized for below 12, which is kind of keeping that number down at the moment. What we're really facing at the moment, and this is kind of the news story in Laos, is fiscal challenges. All the way back into last year, when we were talking about fiscal challenges, we were talking about a downturn in state revenues due to the closing of the borders. So there was quite a reduction in economic activity in Laos. You can see at the bottom left of the presentation, total tax revenue dipped quite a bit in 2020, and that exacerbated a number of the kind of structural debt problems that Laos had to begin with. And Laos took it very seriously. So the National Assembly and the government met last year for an extraordinary session, and they had 2 national agendas that were put on the table. And the first one was combating the fiscal and economic challenges of the country. And the second one, interesting enough, is to combat drugs. So while the country's been in lockdown, the illicit trade of drugs has actually continued to flourish. And you don't have to read too far every day in the newspaper to see a new drug bust happening, where, I mean, wild numbers of like 20 million tablets of meth are seized. And so it's a very serious issue. The government seems to be putting a lot of priority to it. But in this topic, we'll just talk about the fiscal challenges. So what we did was we entered into a bit of an austerity government. They started to reduce the amount of their spending, and this was to match with the reduction in revenues that were collected. But now, I mean, all of those great plans last year have now run into a new problem of we are having high rates of inflation. So and an incredibly weak Lao kip that's putting pressure on the government. So at the moment, the kip has weakened from something like 8,000, 9,000 kip to the dollar to stabilizing at the bank rate of 16,500. So that's 100% weakening of it. This was exacerbated by outside exchange rate markets taking advantage of the weakening kip and then selling it at a really high rate. This then caused a lot of pressure onto businesses importing in with a weakening kip to the dollar. So now we've seen inflation, year-on-year inflation, real inflation move up into the 13% mark. And all of this is putting incredible pressure on just everyday citizens in Laos. We're seeing a doubling of prices. At the same time, we're seeing a reduction in the value of everybody's paychecks. And part of this is fueled by the fuel crisis. So we currently do not have enough fuel in the country to power normal economic activities. It's very often that we see 1 hour to 2 hour long lines to get gas, and then you're rationed out at about 10 liters each time. The gas prices themselves have gone from 8,000 kip a liter all the way up to 20,000 kip. So I mean, that's the equivalent of roughly around $7 a gallon. And in a market like Laos, that's an extremely expensive proposition to be spending your money on. And higher currency, a weakening of the kip, fuel crises, and 80% debt to GDP ratios at the moment that's moved up from 79%, have all caused an enormous amount of pressure for the Lao government. Their debt servicing payments going forward from this year for the next 5 years is expected to be about $1.4 billion. That's about the amount of money that we think that the government currently has in foreign currency exchange in its reserves at any given time. But that's still only enough to cover about 2 months of trade activity. So the opening up of the country, I think, was not just a health decision, but an economic decision, and one that is meant to fight against a lot of these pressures that I just spoke about. But at the same time, so we have the fiscal pressures that are going on, but it doesn't mean that we don't have any opportunities that are happening in Laos. So I mentioned the 5-year socioeconomic development plan. A lot of that had put a priority on bolstering the role of the National Assembly, building its capacity to support and debate with the government over policies. And we've seen that largely take really good effect over the past 2 years. The National Assembly is meeting at the moment, and front and center are all discussions around the government's plan for managing the currency issues to looking at selling off state-owned enterprises, to the approval of 2 new deputy prime ministers that are meant to help provide the prime minister with more support in tackling this kind of wide-based problem. And at the same time, we're seeing, at least from the Asia Foundation's perspective, a continued support and push towards becoming a rule of law country, as it was kind of noted a few years ago. Laos has developed a system of pushing out the rule of law. They've developed a civil code and a criminal code, and now a lot of the new legislations are being aligned to that. There's also a legal aid decree, which provides poor and vulnerable citizens across the country with free access to legal services. And despite COVID and the crises and the fiscal crises that are going forward, all of these plans that the Ministry of Justice is pursuing continue to move forward. We're seeing legal aid offices open in every province in the country, as well as every district. The training of Department of Justice or Ministry of Justice staff, and a slow but steady trickle of citizens coming in to find out what their legal rights are whenever they have mostly civil complaints. Going forward, the structural challenges that existed before the pandemic still exist in Laos. So no matter how we deal with the foreign currency crisis or the fuel crisis, Laos' goals to become land-linked are still on the table and still being pursued. There's obviously some financing challenges in terms of how do you finance these large-scale infrastructure projects. But this map right here is a greater Mekong subregion map of economic corridors. And as you can see, Laos runs right in the middle of almost all of these economic corridors. And so it's aiming to use its location as a transit area, as a linking area. But as you look at its major economic drivers, right? Energy, tourism, agriculture, exports, that what we're thinking is that it's not just land linked by infrastructure, by roads alone, right? So Laos is aiming to bridge and connect itself as an energy producer. It already produces almost 9,000 megawatts of electricity that it exports to its neighbors. It wants to increase its tourism cell, and increasingly as the unemployment rates and people looking for jobs in Laos increases, more people are going to Thailand as they did before. So there's going to be an increased movement of citizens back and forth. There's a connectivity of natural resources. So the biggest one to think about here is obviously the Mekong River, and what affects one country affects another country. But all of this is leading to a situation where Laos has to change the way it thinks about its movement of goods and people and services into a multimodal transport system, where before we basically just had air and road. We're now starting to see some trade across with water in the Mekong. We're seeing the railway being taken advantage of, and now we're seeing increasingly more infrastructure being invested in that will cut across the train line to allow for more rural areas of Laos to aggregate their agricultural products and ship them to the train line for export. The other area of opportunity is the green recovery. So the National Economic Socio-Development Plan lists the green economy as one of its major goals. And what we're seeing in Laos is that from three specific areas that I think are interesting. One is the energy transition. So after COP26, we saw a lot of support for moving into a carbon-free world. Laos itself is blessed with an abundance of forests and jungle. Most of its energy actually comes from non-carbon producing energy. There's one coal-fired power plant, and there's been discussions about more coal coming. But what we're seeing as with the financial constraints in the world and the lack of financing for coal, instead what we're seeing is that there's more reliance on an economic argument for why we need to make the energy transition. So we're seeing more discussions about green hydrogen, solar arrays, and more work putting into connecting variable renewable energies in Laos for both export outside of Laos to its neighbors, as well as internally for domestic energy security. Number two, on the carbon mitigation projects, Laos has a lot of carbon sinks. And I think to date, it hasn't been able to take advantage of this market very well. Traditionally, we've had the REDD+ UN system of preserving forests, and that's provided quite a bit of funding and potential funding to Laos. But Laos is a place where plantation farms, hydropower, solar power also have the ability to create carbon credits. And what we're seeing now is a steady stream of people coming and asking for carbon credits in Laos. There's not a week that goes by that somebody's not coming in and asking what's available. And the truth is there's not very much available. There still needs to be some regulatory work about the development of carbon mitigation projects and the putting up of carbon credits on the markets. And there needs to be increased investment in the technology and the know-how for the very different types of mitigation projects that are available. But this is one aspect of the economy that Laos could really take advantage of. So investments into Laos, stay in Laos, is then able to trade these credits digitally, doesn't have to rely on physical exports, and the money that would come in would then allow it to reinvest in protecting its natural resources. Protecting the natural resources is important because we're seeing an increase in the demand for nature-based tourism solutions. We're seeing people want to worry about their carbon footprint. And Laos has all of this in abundance. So tourism in particular is going to be one of those, the quick, easy way that Laos can start to rebuild its foreign currency reserves and start getting parts of its economy flowing again. Before COVID happened, Laos welcomed about 3 to 4 million people a year, roughly, and that contributed something around $220 million a year in GDP. For Laos, that's a big deal, but it wasn't the cornerstone of Laos' economy. But it's still only about 1% of all ASEAN tourism before COVID. And so Laos can focus on niche and high-end value for nature-based tourism, for cultural tourism, that both helps to put support into current business operators that have survived the pandemic, but then also to build investment opportunities for new high-end businesses that are looking to capture the upper-level market. So that Laos can benefit not just from an increase in people, but an increase in revenue. So in conclusion, I just kind of picked a number of wide topics to go over. There's obviously a lot more that we could talk about in Laos, but Laos is facing a number of difficult issues that are all coming to a head at the tail end of COVID restrictions. And at the same time, we're seeing global inflationary environment that's putting increased pressure that's outside of its control. But with the challenges, there's also opportunities. And as we progress through the 5-year strategy, connectivity and economic diversification, governance strengthening, and economic discipline are all things that can be worked on with the Lao government to move the needle further than might have happened before on some of these structural challenges that all persisted before COVID began. So with that, I think I will hand it over to John and say thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. You've given us a lot to think about, and we already have some questions in the Q&A box. And there was someone who had sent a question prior to this by email, so I'm going to pose that one. There were 2 of them actually first. His name is Danny Cruz. He's the CEO and Managing Director of Headway PM. His questions are: currently the U.S. Export-Import Bank is unable to provide any support to Laos. What is the prognosis for this changing to something meaningful? And his second question is: the U.S. Trade and Development Agency has committed to fund a feasibility study for a 20-megawatt solar project in Laos. Typical USTDA requires proof of follow-on financing for the implementation of whatever is being studied under this funding. What other multilateral agencies are truly available for U.S. exporters to justify further USTDA involvement?
Thanks, John. Thanks, Danny. So I can't give you a specific date on when U.S. Exim Bank might be able to make loans into Laos. I think the debt to GDP structure of Laos makes it a very difficult environment at the moment. Maybe what I can say is that when we look at so first caveat, I'm not an economist, but when we look at the forecast going forward, Laos is going to have a pretty high debt servicing burden for the next 5 years. When you get beyond that 5-year period, you start to see a number of structural changes as these build, operate, transfer models for infrastructure, especially around the energy sector, begin to be handed over to Laos, and they start to take on a greater share of the revenue generated by those hydropower plants. That's going to ease quite a bit of the burden on its debt servicing pressures. So I don't want to say wait 5 years and everything will be fine, but I think we will start to see an easing. And I think the Lao government's committed to not going into a default. And a lot of that will really depend on the restructuring of debt payments that we can expect will probably be coming up or discussed in the next year or so. On the 20 megawatt solar power plant, I think that's great. And I mean, my opinion is that you should go forward with that. Laos is a new market, and any kind of renewable energy projects that are either in a new untested market or have a new technology are always going to have some kind of higher risk or higher externalities than the market can bear. So support for feasibility studies, I think, is quite important for Laos. I think as it goes forward, Laos is going to find that solar and variable renewable energy are going to be its solution for increasing its energy supply. We're seeing that companies are now coming in and asking for quite a bit more energy than was in the power development plan. And Laos is going to have to figure out how to supply that quickly and cheaply. And solar arrays and variable renewables can go up a lot quicker than dam projects. On who might be available for that follow-on financing, I think it will really just depend on the structure of the deal. At the moment, domestic sales are not so reliable, right, in terms of the cash position. So most independent power producers are creating PPA deals with neighboring countries to sell the power into. And so really it will just look at the off-taker's ability to finance to make it attractive. Thanks.
Thanks. Kaylee Sterling poses the question, you mentioned how low official rates of COVID and the low official death count. Do you have a sense of how accurate those official numbers are?
You know, I think all of us spent 2 years thinking these can't possibly be true. And I think it's hard to know how true they are. I mean, even in a place like the US, not everybody goes and gets tested. But I think in the beginning, they could be trusted quite well. I think especially the death rates. Obviously, there's all sorts of, maybe people died at home or, other reasons for death that might have spiked that didn't get attributed to COVID. But just living there for 2 years during the pandemic, I didn't leave the whole time. Knowing the rates of people around me and my staff that got sick, they seem pretty accurate to me, and they've been backed up by the WHO.
Thank you. Michaela Arthur has a few questions. I'm going to pose one first, and we'll go to some others, and we'll go back to maybe some other questions by Michaela. Regarding energy, will plans to transition to green energy help move the government away from reliance on non-renewables? Are non-renewable energy discussions more focused on internal use or export? This is where China is in this conversation with the government. Is Laos looking to enter new negotiations with China that may put the country further into debt or have other future consequences?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a pretty long, complicated answer for a short answer, but I think Laos has been given advice that they need a baseline level of energy. And some of that advice has been to go back to the old standard of coal. So there's about 3 different coal power plants that are potentially on the books for being developed, all in the south. With some of that energy, most of that energy actually being exported, and some of that energy being used for domestic purposes. In all the discussions that I've been in, there's been a desire for the coal in a number of areas in government. On the flip side, there's been a realization that there's no financing available for it at the moment. Even China has mentioned that it won't be financing any new coal-fired power plants abroad. And so that really gives us this idea of, well, what is Laos supposed to do? Their power development plan at their current model looks at it growing electricity usage by 6% per year. Now suddenly it's spiked to maybe 30% as there's been increasing demand. The overall outlook is that there's been a reliance on independent power producers to finance and then sell internationally their electricity. And that's led to an under investment in the transmission system. So any new domestically run power plants actually find it quite difficult to connect into that domestic system and find a reliable off-taker. So I think there's quite a few reforms that need to happen domestically first, in terms of creating stability in the system. Both there's an excess in the wet season and a deficit in the dry season. So fixing that first, I think, is the main priority, and then looking at where the energy mix is going to take it.
Oh, Walter Streeter from the Fletcher School at Tufts University wants to ask about the economic corridors you showed. Judging by the visuals, the regions bordering Thailand and China look more economically active than the regions bordering Vietnam and Cambodia. Does that match the reality in Laos? Are the northern and western portions of the country developing faster than the southern and eastern portions? If so, how is this being addressed?
Thanks, Walter. Nice to hear somebody from the Fletcher School, my alma mater, actually. So I think the North has developed quite quickly, right? There's been a lot of agricultural investments up in the North, all aimed at exporting up into China. But at the same time, the main trading partner is still Thailand, right? There's a long border that's easily traversed right across the Mekong. And there's a lot of trade that goes back and forth between Thailand and Laos, and then more specifically down in the south, the very thin area right in between, so Savannah Ket area is kind of traditionally the rice basket of Laos, and there's a lot of trade that goes on back and forth between Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. Laos is becoming a bit more of a, they've put a lot of support into special economic zones, and now there's some criticisms about which ones and how they're being used, but what they're trying to do is to import more materials, provide some added value to it. And now that they've got the train line and a few more international connections to then ship on as a Lao-based product rather than just being a pass-through country. In terms of how it's being addressed, the balance, I think you're right. There's definitely a lot more, there's a lot less international commerce going on between Laos and Cambodia. I think that's mainly trying to change in terms of potential tourism and movement of people, but also the electricity trade. There's power plants that are being developed down south to sell directly into Cambodia. But mainly we're talking about agricultural products are the main staple for exports for Laos, beyond mining and energy.
Alan Kelly is asking, the World Bank and other multi-development banks have classified Laos as fragile, driven by financial and fiscal debt and poor performance. Given current inflationary pressures, the fiscal situation is likely to worsen, with socioeconomic impacts on the local population, and the government delivery of service and debt levels will increase. What do you see as likely options in the next 2 to 3 years to tackle these fiscal debt problems, such as restructuring, write-offs, grants, loan support? Has the government accepted that there's a critical problem, and is it open to drastic options? I mean, from reading this question from Alan, there was an article this morning in Nikkei Asia that talked about, is Laos the next Sri Lanka? And that saying that the economy is collapsed. I don't think it's, personally, I don't think it's that, but they certainly have great fiscal challenges that's going to require a lot of restructuring. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Thanks, John. The government's taking this incredibly serious, right? I mean, and no government is going to want to present itself as if it's a candidate for default. So the fact that this is in the national agenda, that there has been a reshuffle in the cabinet twice now, and that more and more efforts are being put into stabilizing both the KIP as well as opening up the country to get more foreign currency reserves. I think these are all really good indications. At the same time, they're taking, I don't know if you'd call them drastic measures, but a crisis is a good opportunity at the same time. And there's been a really hard look at a number of these state-owned enterprises for reform. And essentially, most of the recommendations come down to selling off these assets to get them off the books. They're underperforming, they're not strategic, and they lose a lot of money. There's even a hard look going on at EDL, the electricity provider or distributor of Laos, which is a state-owned electricity company, because it owns about 30% of all the state-backed debt currently. And so it's going to be a mix of hard decisions. We already saw on one of my screens that the government has tightened the belt. It's spending less. It's moving towards digitalization of its business registration and tax collection to try to increase its revenue collection for people that haven't traditionally been paying taxes. But I think what's going to have to happen is there's going to have to be an easing of the debt servicing obligations to get them through the next 2 to 3 years. There's going to be an increased emphasis on agricultural exports, mining exports, and energy exports to right side the balance sheet. And there'll be increasing focus on not letting through underperforming loans, right? So a lot of this has come from decisions that were made a decade ago on power plants that just haven't been connected to anywhere, and the demand hasn't materialized. And there's still the obligation by the government to pay for and buy that electricity. So there's a lot of really careful looking at any new loans that are coming up for signature. Thanks.
Masashi Nishihara from the Research Institute for Peace and Security asked the question, what is China's role in Laos's economic development? I've heard China has driven Laos into extensive dependency. And let me combine this with another question that Michaela Arthur had asked about the high-speed train that China has developed. It opened on Laos National Day in December 2nd last year. How is that benefiting Laos, if at all, at this juncture?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no easy answer to say whether one country has forced another country into a debt situation. But I mean, China has for a long time been a place where Laos has been able to finance a lot of its projects that it's wanted to finance. Nobody else has come to offer to build high-speed railways or to build highways. China has invested in a few different, it sees Laos as a place for its businesses to invest in as well, particularly around the agricultural sectors and the tourism sectors. So, I probably won't comment on what I think China's doing or where, it's pushed one way or the other, but just to say Laos is in a place where that it really wants to develop itself. It has a plan for connectivity, and that requires a lot of financing. And everybody knows that planning for infrastructure is difficult, getting the money for infrastructure is difficult. And so, I think we may have borrowed a bit too much. It doesn't help that we've hit an economic downturn, but having these roads and corridors available to Laos is what's going to help it also climb out of its current situation. On the train line, look, the train line is really good. It's a lot of people point to the train as a huge debt, but in fact, the Lao government didn't take out that much debt. China invested its own money as well. And then there's a joint state-owned enterprise or a train enterprise of China and Laos that was created to take on other parts of the debt. So unsecured debt linked to the country. It's allowed more people to travel to the north and back to Vientiane. I think the recent stats are that in the past 6 months, 400,000 people have ridden on the train, and it's allowed, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of tons of goods to be exported out, both into Thailand as well as up into China. It's cut the travel time for exports from something like 46 hours to 9 hours from the south to the north. So these are all efficiencies that Laos really needs. The key for the train line part of it is for moving of people and tourism, but it's mostly going to be an economic freight line. And the key is actually internal connectivity, building out those roads to rural areas, the value chains that are able to aggregate farm products of disconnected rural communities, and then provide them with a market that they didn't have before.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question, Todd. When I spent a considerable amount of time in Laos about 8-9 years ago, there were 198 lawyers in Laos. 90% of those were in Vientiane. Given the importance of law and legal development to that country, it's not a lot of lawyers, even for, there's probably more lawyers on one block in K Street than there would be, than there are perhaps in all of Laos now. I was wondering how that figure has increased or improved, and if you could comment on how Laos is trying to basically strengthen its legal system and enable its people to have access to legal recourse.
Thanks, John. So I think it didn't grow so much from the 8 or 9 years since you were there to 3 years ago. It went from, I think, the 198 that you mentioned to 250. So in those intervening years, 50 new lawyers got accreditation. Over the past 3 years, we've seen a jump up by 100 people. So, you've gone from 50 in 8 years to 100 in just the past 3 years. And it's increasing further than that. So there's a big emphasis on the people that go through the training at the National Institute of Justice, or the FLP, the Faculty of Law in International Relations. And what's key is that the way the system is set up is after you graduate, you have to then go do an internship, unpaid, and then you have to do another year-long course with the NIJ, unpaid, and then you have to go do another internship, unpaid, before you can actually then go take your test. And so there's all these kind of structural blocks to becoming a career lawyer. And so a lot of people just get diverted off into other areas. So the government's been trying to streamline that practice, providing scholarships for students who then need to work unpaid for a while. But also as we see a growing number of law firms that are coming with the economic, kind of the increase in economic activity, especially for commercial law, we're seeing more areas where they can do their internships. We're seeing more people able to just get support jobs while they're going through school. And so but it's still going to be a pretty slow progress because generally speaking, there's not a career path for a lawyer, even a private lawyer. You might get into one of the 2 or 3 or 4 different law firms that are there. You might work for the government, but most people don't know how to make a full-time living as a private lawyer. So what they tend to do is they'll take a job, for example, with the Asia Foundation, and then they'll take on private clients on the side. And that's just the growing marketplace that will just take time to move forward.
Okay. That's going to be very discouraging for people who might be interested to want to do it, because it will be a financial sacrifice.
Yeah, and a lot of these students are coming from, not very affluent homes, and they can't afford not to work. Right.
Well, it's fair enough. Kelly Sterling from the International Republican Institute's Asia Division here in Washington asked, you mentioned Laos is trying to improve its governing capacity. What incentive does the Lao government have for real reform and accountability? Is there a limit to how strong the rule of law can become under the current system of incentives?
I don't know. It's probably not the thing I'm supposed to say, but is there a limit on accountability? I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on how much pressure there is to make reforms. Laos said that it's committed to becoming a rule of law country. It certainly has put into its plans to both strengthen the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, as well as access to justice for low and income people, as well as we see a progressive strengthening of the ability of the National Assembly to question ministers, to question the government on their plans and hold them partially accountable, at least through this forum. Is it ever going to be a system like in other countries? I don't think so. It's its own system, its own political method, but at the same time, there seems to be some contestability that's building within the system. And I think what we're seeing is the end result of a series of a lack of contestability in the 2000s with all these loans that were given out, and certainly providing a bit more accountability is a lot less expensive than having to rewrite the economy and help people's bottom line financial situations in the villages. So I think that there's a movement in that direction. I think it's positive. I think it's genuine. And we'll just have to continue to support and help them in that progress and see where it goes.
Yeah. Michaela Arthur has another question regarding border closures. She's curious to hear more about how the large population of migrant workers and their families in Laos have fared.
Yeah, so we run with the U.S. government a trafficking in persons program. And that obviously touches a lot on the migrant worker issue. I think what we saw during COVID is especially a lot of people came back from Thailand. That swelled the population here in Laos and caused unintended consequences. I think for a very long time, there's this idea that the family farm would be the backstop that would protect you during all sorts of crises. And we had to work really hard to support some of our beneficiaries and our staff when their parents called them back and said, you need to come back to the farm and help us farm because we need to generate more food. And so that's been the normal reaction whenever there's a crisis. The problem here is that it also hit at a time of drought. It hit at a time of lower yields for farming communities, a lack of inputs, and the realization that there was just much more kids and people spread out across the country that when you bring them back to help on the farm, there's actually not enough farm to produce the amount of food that you were thinking. Further, there's been a lot of pressure on the foraging. So most families will go out and just take things from the jungle, and years of pressure on foraging and forest ecosystems has reduced the productivity of that as well. So I think what we saw was incredible rates of malnutrition, or increasing rates of malnutrition and lack of food during the COVID time. Most people leaving their jobs in things like the tourism industry and going to farm, and then increased pressure to move back out once the borders opened. And now we're seeing hundreds of thousands of people go back across the borders, looking for jobs in Thailand specifically.
I would also think that for those who were farming the remittances that they would be sending back from working in Thailand, I mean, all of a sudden that dries up.
That's
Reminds me during the financial crisis in Thailand in the late 1990s that people were going back, and not that the farming families didn't love their children, but at the same time they were looking at it as, well, this was money that we were getting from you coming from mostly Bangkok, maybe Phuket, but now it's another mouth to feed. So putting that added pressure.
Just a note on that. I mean, I read a statistic the other day, I think, if I remember correctly, so find the statistic yourself, but something like a quarter of the population has been migrant workers at any given time in Laos. So that's quite a bit, and it contributes a lot for the remittances.
No, that's indeed very true. Early on in your talk, Todd, you talked about the government cracking down on drug production. And it also then sort of reminded me of about 20 years ago in Thailand, where there was a lot of methamphetamines. And you mentioned specifically methamphetamines. 20 years ago, it was estimated that 5% of the whole country of Thailand was addicted to drugs, and that there was one addict in each village throughout Thailand, ranging in age between the ages of 5 and 70. I'm curious, how big of a problem is addiction, and how is that being addressed?
I don't have numbers for you, but I think the fact that the National Assembly and the government put it as a national crisis, and anecdotal evidence of seeing addictions in villages with families, I think we can assume it's quite widespread,
Mhm.
especially around meth. And of course, there's the international flow of drugs issue that is a concern in Laos, but I think for the Lao authorities in particular, it's the effect that drugs are having on the stability of village lives. You know, when I first moved to Laos 3.5 years ago, petty theft had started to increase, and that was attributed to people stealing things just to be able to go buy methamphetamines. It wasn't an economic-based kind of criminality. It was more a drug-related one, and I think that's increased specifically during the pandemic time, unfortunately.
Yeah. You also mentioned about how Laos is looking towards tourism to help jumpstart their economy. I think they've always been trying to do that. When I was there 8, 9 years ago, they were talking about trying to appeal more to the high-end tourists as opposed to the backpackers. They were calling it ecotourism, and to help protect the environment, and also bring in sort of more higher value tourists for the government's purposes. I was curious. I mean, in order for tourism to really work for a place like Laos, given that is landlocked or land linked, however you wish to phrase it, Thailand before the pandemic had an enormous amount of tourists coming in, and most of those people who would go to Laos had been spending time in Thailand before going there, not making a specifically being interested in traveling to Laos. It would be along on the side. I know that earlier this month, the Prime Minister of Laos met with Thai Prime Minister Prayut. Are there any discussions about how to try to, sort of link tourism that more tourists could go to Laos who were first initially visiting Thailand? Any strategy?
I don't know of any specific strategies, but I do know there's a few interesting. So Laos, I think you're right. It's a secondary country that's going to be added on to another country. There may be, you get a few people that are coming in specifically just to visit Laos, but usually Laos is going to be packaged with Vietnam, probably not Myanmar these days, and Bangkok. So you're going to get a mix of a beach vacation and a kind of upland, cultural, natural vacation. We did see just yesterday or the day before that new flights have restarted again from Luang Prabang, which is probably the most famous of the tourist attractions here in Laos, directly to Bangkok. And so even before COVID, we had more flights flying out of Luang Prabang than we did out of Vientiane, the capital. And that was mostly just because that was the big tourist offering that people wanted to go see. They've made it easy by having a great airport there and increasing the types of flights that can come in. One kind of hidden statistic, I think, inside of these numbers we always assume that everybody's coming from Europe and different places, but in fact, I'd say almost 50% or more of the tourists that come into Laos are actually coming from Thailand. So you have a lot of people from the Isan area coming over. You have people flying up from Bangkok, and I think increasingly once China opens up again, we'll have, especially with the rail line, more Chinese tourists coming down. And so of course we want to encourage more tourists to come, but I think the key is to encouraging high value tourists. There's also been, obviously it's a big place for Korean tourists as well, and to some Japanese tourists, but mostly it's a Korean market these days, or in the past. So really building the model of high-end specific tourists that are coming in, spending a higher value of money. I think the backpackers and lower end tourists, I think are, maybe spending 3 or 4 days, spending something like $200 a trip, which isn't really that much when you add it all up, right? I think we're going to continue to have a mix of both. It makes sense. It's easy just to go across the river from Thailand, from most places. But I think strengthening everything that we do to strengthen the transport sector, the road connectivity, the rail links, and the air links will have a positive effect for Laos generally.
Well, having been to Luang Prabang once, I'm glad to hear that there are direct flights now from Bangkok to there. I think it makes an enormous amount of sense. We've are running up against the hour, and Todd, you've given us an excellent presentation. It's a very rich discussion, as evidenced by the questions that were posed by people. There were quite a number of them. I want to thank our audience this morning for taking the time to join us and for your questions. And Todd, thank you for your comments. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, Laos does not get very much attention in Washington. We're happy that we've had this discussion. We're looking forward to the next 2 or 3 years being, important years in Laos' economic and social development. We certainly want to have you back. And the next time we have you back, we like to be all in the same room, and so that we can have a discussion in person. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope you all have a good day. Thanks again. Thank you, Todd. All right. Stay well. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.